Okay, so moving on, we're talking. You've got a picture behind you. Who's that, Jace? Tell us
That
why
is
is that?
James Douglas Morrison, Jim Morrison, lead singer of the Doors. This Saturday is the 50th anniversary of his death in Paris in 1971. So I thought we'd one of our topics this week we'd have a look back at Jim's life and the Doors and have a quick chat about him. Celebrate his life if you like, but also the fact that it's 50 years it's such an iconic rock music character died, and of course he died at the same time, relatively same time, within a sort of a 9-month time span between Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin, because Jim apparently famously once said, first there was Jimmy, then there's Janis, and then you're talking to number 3. So he predicted, because of his lifestyle, he predicted his death would be while he was young. And of course, it started off in around that time, the 27 Club, because of the number of celebrities, especially rock stars, who have died at the age of 27. People like Kurt Cobain, for example, as well.
Wow. Why is that? Do you think just a rock and roll drug taking lifestyle, living life on the edge?
It's living life on the edge, yeah. And I think possibly, if you're suffering from mental health issues, maybe that have been brought on by heavy drug use, it's possible that in a few of the cases, only possible, that joining the 27 Club is something that people aspire to. If you don't see your life going anywhere, if you don't see the values that you feel to be believed to be important are being upheld around you within the world in which you live, and you want to clock off, then I think there are instances where people have decided, I'm 27, just like Jim, Janis, Jimmy, etc. Goodbye and good night. Which is very sad, but at the same time, I think it's exploited by record companies. I think, if you look at the number of artists who died young, and the sales of their music have gone through the roof, been extraordinary as a direct result of their deaths. It goes back through, as I say, through musical history. If you look back, for example, to the months after John Lennon died, he died obviously in December 1980, but in January, February, March of 81, record sales, not only Double Fantasy, obviously the album that he brought out just before his death, but all those albums and the Beatles stuff dominated the charts. But bringing us back to the Doors, they were formed in 1965, a collection of guys who'd been to LA art school or film school, or friends of friends. In 1965, they formed Jim and Ray Manzarek, who was the keyboardist, coming together again on the beach after graduation and just saying, what are you going to do now? And they started talking, and that was it, really. That sort of started it all off. And then the band were joined by Robbie Krieger on guitar and John Densmore, who was a jazz drummer. And the rest is history. But they only had a short life, 6 years in effect. The last album, which they recorded at the latter end of 1970, which was LA Woman. And then Jim went off to Paris in the early part of 71, and of course never came home. He's buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, which I visited in 1991. That was 30 years ago now. And at the time, I'm not sure about now, but at the time, Père Lachaise Cemetery, because of the fact that people like Jim Morrison, Edith Piaf, Oscar Wilde, etc., were there, was the 4th biggest tourist attraction in France.
Good Lord! And
I suppose we're all in some ways guilty of it, but it still obviously relates around, I think, our obsession, or many people's obsession with death. and not knowing what comes next, and especially if someone dies young, I think that just adds to their kudos, if you like, adds to the mystery that surrounds. Yeah, well, we obviously, that's what we create, isn't it? And then when we read the biographies of all these different people, how many of them are 100% accurate? How many of them have bits and bobs put into them? I mean, it's a classic case, obviously, here with the Oliver Stone film that was released in '91 on the Doors. And it's about as accurate, if you like, as Bohemian Rhapsody is. You know, there's a whole range of fictitious moments, fictitious characters, events that occurred that were Hollywood. They weren't a documentary. They weren't about enlightening us. They're about principally entertaining us and get as many people to attend and watch the film as possible, and to maximize their revenue, which I think is a real shame, because people will walk away from these bios and they'll think they know what happened, but in fact, most of it, or certainly large parts of it, are fake, are false. But again, that's, you know, that's for another discussion about the nature of Hollywood and the nature of the way in which reality is constructed by corporations for us, so that we effectively live a lot of our lives as lies. But Jim saw it. I mean, you know, Jim despaired at the Vietnam War. He despaired at the American involvement. He despaired that his father was very high up in the US Navy, and in fact, he commanded a ship. He despaired at all these things, and it doesn't help, I think, if you haven't got a close relationship with your family, because you at some point in your life, especially when you are in despair, it can be your family that drags you out of it. And in this case, he didn't have that relationship for that to happen. So yeah.
And what are the things, Jason? I mean, you're obviously a huge fan. What are the things that appealed to you most about the Doors, and the legacy of Jim Morrison's music? Obviously, as you say, it was a short period of time, 6 years or so, that the music was created. What's special about it, I guess, is what I'm saying.
I think he's one of those people that you find particularly attractive when you're young, because it's not just the music. He was a poet. He read extensively. He was into the French poet Arthur Rimbaud, people like Oscar Wilde, obviously, but he was very much into the existentialist philosophers, which I think when you're younger and you think, the world's your oyster, you're more likely to find as the pathway maybe for your next step, for you yourself as an individual. You learn later, especially if you're intellectual and you go on to university or you go on to postgraduate studies and you study these types of subjects, you learn that it's only one side of the coin, and there's parts of it that are quite significantly misguided. But certainly if you're young, that type of lifestyle on the edge is exciting. But he, of course, lived his life on the edge permanently. As Gray Slick from Jefferson Airplane said, anybody offered Jim a pill, he'd take it. He wasn't one of these people who would walk down the street and say, in her words, no, thank you, no, thank you, yes, please. It was always yes, please, yes, please, yes, please. And of course, his big drug, his big dependency was alcohol. And again, I think, for young people, when they're going through their teens and into their 20s, for a lot of them, they consume significant amounts of alcohol. So I really do think that there's that part of him. But of course, his was an illness. Addiction, alcoholism, it's an illness, but it wasn't recognized at the time in the late 1960s. It wasn't like it is now. He'd have probably, if he'd done all this 40, 50 years later, he'd have ended up in a clinic probably or possibly, and might have lived a lot longer. But I think that burning bright and fading out quickly is an attractive thing for, as I say, especially within the way in which materialist consumerist culture that we've had in place for the last half a century.
Yeah. And would you describe, you mentioned his, opposition to the Vietnam War, would you describe him as an anti-establishment figure, and the lyrics of Doors songs fall into that kind of category?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. Yeah. There's one of the very first environmental songs that pointed out what humans were doing, Ship of Fools. I think it's on Morrison Hotel. But you're talking about 1968, 69. They were ahead of their time. There's no doubt about it. The fusion of blues, rock, jazz in the Doors songs, and anybody obviously who's seen Apocalypse Now would know the end, which is a momentous part of that film in terms of the build-up to the tensions in the early part of the film. And so they've got a lot of songs that Break On Through, for example, was very much about LSD. The Doors themselves got their name from the William Blake line. If the doors of perception are cleansed, men sick will see things as they truly are, infinite. So it was that understanding of that existentialist philosophy that you can see a lot more if you can open up your mind to allow your senses to have much more scope, if you like, for attaching themselves to reality. So there's so many songs that the Doors wrote that if you just sit and listen to that particular song and what he's singing about, what the band are trying to get across, and obviously the most famous one is Light My Fire, which most people have heard about. But like Jim said, I got sick and fed up of playing that song. Even though he didn't write the song, Robbie Krieger wrote the song. You got sick of it because you'd be at a concert and all you'd hear from the people in the darkness, the audience was, "Play Like My Fire, play Like My Fire." And I suppose if you are of that type of mentality, personality, where you're pushing back, there comes a point where you push back against the audience as well and say, I'm not playing Like My Fire anymore. Like Radiohead would stop playing Creep, for example. They just got sick and fed up with it. So you want to play the other stuff. There's loads of other stuff in your repertoire that you adore and you love that you want your audiences to hear, and not the same old songs every night.
I was thinking of, for some reason, I was thinking of great artists from centuries ago, painting in front of it, and they go through different periods. These great painters, and I was imagining them creating artwork in front of an audience who are calling out for do some cubism, show us your cubism. No, I've moved on anyway. And for any young listeners who aren't aware of the Doors, a number of albums that that you'd recommend, and the kind of feel of them. How would you describe that?
I mean, the problem is, I think, is often at this day and age, you're probably better off listening to the compilations. Seriously, listen to the compilations, because you will have all the tracks or some of the tracks that I've heard that one before. And then you think, okay, I'll look further into the repertoire. It's not like the old days where you used to go around to your friends' bedrooms. It was vinyl. They just got the new album in and they put it on, and you'd sit there and you smoke weed all night, and you'd come away thinking, that's the best thing since whatever. So you've got the early stuff. You've got the eponymous album, The Doors, and you go into Strange Days. And then you go through the repertoire where the Soft Parade, for example, where they started to experiment more with a bit of sort of band sound, trumpets, excuse me, and different instruments. And then they came back in line more with Waiting for the Sun and Morrison Hotel, and then they finished off with probably, you know, to finish off with an album, bearing in mind that the Doors with Jim didn't make anything after that, which is LA Woman, which is an absolutely classic, wonderful album. But if you want the end, it's on the Doors. If you want When the Music's Over, it's on Strange Days. So yeah, you know, it's if you like rock, blues, jazz, fusion, so to speak, and you like a serious edge, and you like musicians who aren't playing a game to get rich, they're doing it purely and solely because of the love of the music, especially, it has to be said, Jim and John Densmore, the drummer. Ray and Robbie were more, let's say, they're a bit looser, a bit more laissez-faire with their materialistic thing. You know, they were prepared, for example, to sell Light My Fire as a jingle for an advert. And it was Jim and John, especially Jim, who said, that's not why we formed this band, man. You know, if you're going to do that, I'm off. So that was, you know, that's where John and Jim were really quite similar. But it didn't create, maybe it created certain situations, but, you know, it didn't create anything that was a dynamic that was going to destroy the band. But it was certainly something that was there underneath the surface. Yeah. So
hopefully some young people, you know, any younger viewers that aren't already aware of the Doors, go and get yourself some of those albums, or as you say, maybe start off with a sort of compilation album of the best of the Doors.
Yeah. And read some of the biographies. I mean, just finishing off, we at Doors Eye, we reviewed the last biography that was put out there, or the last one that I'm certainly aware of, which was by Mick Wall, back in 1916. A terrific book, and I personally reviewed it as well. So if you go on to Doors Eye and just put in the Doors, for example, and you have my fairly short review it was on the 4th of July as well. It was 5 years ago, so it was that would have been around the 45th anniversary of Jim's death. But yeah, you know, just go out there and check stuff out. You know, don't believe the hype, as they say, Tom. Always go and find out things for yourself, and always ask those questions and seek your own answers. Don't just allow people to say, oh, you know, he's a drunk, he was an addict, he was promiscuous. Yeah, there's millions of people like that, but don't write them off, because whatever those things are, those things are just parts of somebody's personality. They are not the whole person. The whole person is a far, far more complicated person. And we all deserve to be listened to and heard, as long as we've got something that's worth listening to. Yeah.
And isn't it great? You know, Morrison's obviously one of those, as you mentioned earlier, a poet. But if in life we take time to listen to people that have something to say, and that also say it in such a special way, you know, that's worth the time spent.